Picture this, a dimly lit chamber deep beneath the cobblestone streets of medieval Spain. The air is thick with smoke and fear. Iron chains rattle against damp stone walls, and the faint crackle of fire echoes in the dark. Somewhere, a man whispers a prayer, his last one. A hooded figure steps forward, holding a torch that glows against the instruments of agony. This isn't the scene of a horror movie. This is history. This is the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, a name that still chills the spine centuries later, was one of the most feared institutions in human history. Established in 1478 by King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, it began as a tool to root out heresy and preserve the purity of the Catholic faith. But soon, it grew into something far darker. A system of terror that blurred the line between religion and cruelty. What started as an effort to unify Spain under one faith turned into a nightmare that consumed thousands of lives. Under the authority of the Church and Crown, inquisitors held the power of life and death. Their victims ranged from Jews and Muslims forced to convert, to ordinary Christians accused of blasphemy, witchcraft, or simply speaking against the Church. No one was safe. Torture chambers became sanctuaries of truth, and confessions extracted through pain were treated as divine justice. The Inquisition's shadow would stretch across centuries, shaping not only Spain, but the conscience of Europe itself. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback below. It helps us bring more forgotten truths and chilling tales of history back to light. Imagine living in 15th century Spain, a land glowing with golden cathedrals, echoing with the prayers of the faithful, and yet cloaked in the darkness of fear. The Spanish Inquisition was not born overnight. It emerged from the ashes of conquest and the desperate desire of monarchs to unify their kingdom under one belief. After centuries of war between Christians and Muslims, the newly unified Spain wanted to purify its soul. But what does purity mean when it comes at the cost of human lives? Ferdinand and Isabella, hailed as defenders of the faith, convinced themselves that religious conformity was the key to stability. In their eyes, heresy was not just a sin. It was treason against God and the state. And so, in the year 1478, with the blessing of Pope Sixtus IV, the Inquisition began its grim work. At first, its targets were the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under threat, but who were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. Whispers spread through cities like Seville, Toledo, and Granada. They still light candles on Friday nights. They do not eat pork. They do not believe in the Virgin. Suspicion was enough to condemn. People vanished overnight, their homes seized, their names erased. The accused would be dragged into a tribunal, a dark room illuminated by flickering candles, where inquisitors sat in robes of black and crimson. Their tone was calm, almost holy, but their questions cut deeper than any blade. Do you believe in the true church? Have you denied the faith? Do you confess your heresy? And if the accused hesitated, even for a heartbeat, it was over. The Inquisition's creed was simple. Confession through pain was proof of salvation. The first torture chambers appeared beneath monasteries and castles, where instruments of unimaginable cruelty were designed not merely to kill, but to break the soul. The rack, a wooden frame where victims were stretched until their joints dislocated. The strappado, where hands were tied behind the back and the body hoisted into the air, shoulders tearing from their sockets. And the water torture, where rags were forced down the throat as water poured endlessly, simulating drowning. The cries of the condemned echoed through stone corridors, yet outside, church bells still rang in perfect harmony. But here's the chilling part. These acts were justified as mercy. The Church taught that pain purified the soul, that suffering would cleanse sin before death. Priests would stand beside the torturer, whispering prayers as bones cracked. The condemned were told, better to suffer now than burn forever in hell. Imagine hearing that, knowing that the men who held your life in their hands believed they were saving your soul by destroying your body. Over time, the Inquisition spread its shadow across Spain like a plague. It reached into every corner, the cities, the villages, even the monasteries. Neighbors turned against neighbors, friends whispered against each other, and children learned to fear their own families. Anyone could accuse anyone. A simple rumor, a jealous word, could summon the Inquisition's knock at your door. There was no defense. There were no appeals. Once taken, few ever returned. By 1483, the Inquisition had appointed its most feared leader, Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor. He believed that terror was the key to purity. Under his command, thousands were interrogated, tortured, and executed. Public burnings, known as autos de fe, became spectacles of faith. Imagine standing in a crowded square as men, women, and even children were led in chains to the pyres. Choirs sang hymns while flames devoured human flesh. Crowds prayed as the condemned screamed, believing that witnessing this horror would bring them closer to God. Torquemada watched from a distance, unmoved. To him, it was justice. To history, it was madness sanctified by faith. Experts today describe the Inquisition as an early form of totalitarian control, a fusion of religion and politics that turned belief into a weapon. The Inquisitors did not simply punish heresy. They built a network of spies, informants, and clerical enforcers who turned the entire nation into a prison. Confessions were written in Latin, trials held in secret, and verdicts announced in rituals of fire. And yet, for all its power, the Inquisition was not invincible. There were moments of resistance, small acts of courage in the face of unimaginable fear. One story tells of a woman named Maria de Cazalla, accused of heresy in the 1530s. She was educated, outspoken, and devout, qualities that made her dangerous. When she was arrested, she refused to confess. She endured weeks of torture, her body broken, but her faith unshaken. Her interrogators could not understand how a woman so faithful could challenge the Church's authority. "I only follow God," she told them, "not men who claim to speak for him." Though she was eventually released, her life was destroyed. Yet her defiance became a quiet symbol of resistance, proof that even in the darkest chambers, the human spirit could not be fully crushed. As the Inquisition grew, its reach extended beyond Spain. It followed explorers and missionaries to the New World, spreading its fear to Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. In these lands, indigenous people were forced to convert, their beliefs labeled as paganism, their rituals burned and forbidden. Entire cultures were silenced under the same justification, saving souls through suffering. Historians estimate that over 150,000 people were tried during the Spanish Inquisition, and while not all were executed, nearly all endured humiliation, imprisonment, or torment. Imagine walking through one of those cold chambers today. The walls are scarred with centuries of pain. Iron shackles still hang from the stone. You can almost hear the echo of screams long faded into dust. Some say the air itself feels heavy, as if the stones remember what they've seen. In Toledo, Seville, and Madrid, the remnants of these dungeons still exist. Silent museums of faith turned to fear. Visitors speak of chills, of whispers that seem to come from nowhere, of invisible hands brushing their shoulders. It's as if the past refuses to rest. But even then, the Inquisition never truly believed it was evil. It called itself righteous, necessary, divine. That is perhaps the most haunting truth of all, that some of the greatest atrocities in history were committed not out of hatred, but out of conviction. The inquisitors prayed before torturing. They blessed the flames before lighting the pyres. They believed they were defending heaven itself, and that belief, blind and absolute, became their greatest weapon. The Inquisition's legacy would endure for more than 350 years. It adapted with time, sometimes fading, sometimes roaring back with new intensity, but always watching, always judging. By the time it was finally abolished in 1834, countless souls had been lost to its fire. Yet the echoes of its cruelty still linger, not just in history books, but in the conscience of humanity. Because what the Inquisition revealed, more than faith, more than fear, was the terrifying power of belief when it goes unchecked. As the 16th century dawned, the Inquisition's grip only tightened. Spain was now a vast empire, stretching from the golden shores of the Caribbean to the cold stone cities of Europe. And yet its spiritual heart was enslaved by paranoia. The Inquisition became the unseen eye of the crown, watching, recording, punishing. The people learned to hide their thoughts, to speak in half-truths, to cross themselves twice before every sentence. Even priests feared their own sermons. The message was clear. Faith was no longer a personal journey. It was obedience, measured in silence. But here's the chilling part. The more the Church claimed to save souls, the darker its actions became. Torture was not just punishment. It was procedure. The inquisitors believed that a confession extracted through agony was still valid in the eyes of God. Their manuals detailed every technique. How long a man could survive on the rack before his heart gave out. How many turns of the rope before a woman's arms tore from their sockets. Each act of cruelty was written, signed, sealed, as though documenting holiness itself. Imagine being a prisoner in one of those chambers. You've been accused of heresy, perhaps for reading a forbidden book, or for saying you once saw a vision. You're dragged into a cold cell, the air damp with centuries of despair. The inquisitor asks if you confess. You say no. He nods almost kindly, and then he signals to the torturer. The ropes tighten, the pain begins. Every scream echoes against stone walls that have heard thousands before yours. The priest whispers a prayer beside you, his eyes calm. To him, your agony is a step toward salvation. It's easy to imagine this as a medieval nightmare, but even as the Renaissance blossomed, an age of art, science, and reason, the Inquisition thrived. In the very years Leonardo painted and Galileo watched the stars, Spain burned its thinkers and dreamers. Philosophers, scientists, and even poets faced suspicion. The mere act of questioning could be fatal. One of the Inquisition's greatest victims was the theologian and scholar Fray Luis de Leon. His crime? Translating parts of the Bible into Spanish so ordinary people could read it. For that, he was imprisoned for 5 years, tortured and silenced. When he was finally released, he returned to his university, stood before his students, and began his first lecture with a single sentence. As we were saying yesterday, that quiet defiance still echoes through history. The Inquisition was also a master of spectacle. Its trials and executions were public theater. Rituals meant to inspire both terror and obedience. The autos de fe were grand ceremonies where sentences were read, confessions announced, and heretics paraded through the streets in penitential robes marked with flames and demons. The condemned would be led to wooden stakes, watched by nobles, priests, and crowds that prayed as fire consumed the bodies. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to see better. Drums beat, banners waved, and sermons filled the air. And as the smoke rose, Spain believed it had grown holier. But what happens to a nation when cruelty becomes ceremony? Fear seeps into its bones. The Inquisition didn't just punish. It redefined what was possible. Artists learned to paint what pleased the church. Writers learned to hide meaning between the lines. Entire generations were taught that faith and fear were the same thing. And yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Some priests started to question. Some nobles began to doubt. A few whispered that perhaps God did not demand so much blood. One of the most infamous cases came in 1600, when the Inquisition targeted a physician named Rodrigo Lopez, a converted Jew who served as a royal doctor. He was accused of plotting against the crown, a charge built on lies and prejudice. Despite his loyalty and years of service, Lopez was tortured until he confessed to crimes he never committed. As he was led to his death, he declared, "I love my God and my king." History would later reveal that he was innocent. His only crime was being born to the wrong faith. Meanwhile, beyond Spain, the Inquisition spread like wildfire. In Portugal, Italy, and the Spanish colonies, its influence reached across oceans. Indigenous peoples in the Americas faced the same inquisitorial zeal. Their gods denounced as demons, their rituals destroyed. In Mexico, inquisitors held public trials where native shamans were forced to confess to witchcraft. In Lima and Cartagena, black slaves and freed Africans were accused of consorting with the devil. The Inquisition adapted to every land it touched, shaping itself into whatever form fear demanded. But by the 17th century, the world was changing. Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge the Church's authority. Voices of reason whispered in salons and secret gatherings, "Truth cannot be tortured into existence." Writers like Voltaire and Montesquieu condemned the Inquisition as barbaric, calling it a stain on civilization. And slowly, even within Spain, the whispers grew louder. The monarchy itself began to see the Inquisition as an obstacle, a relic that frightened progress away. Yet it did not die easily. Power built on fear rarely does. Imagine the psychological weight of living under such rule. Generations passed without the freedom to think, to doubt, to dream. Every confession, every execution was meant not just to punish, but to teach obedience. People learned to smile while hiding their thoughts, to pray with trembling lips. Even today, in the ruins of old inquisitorial courts, historians find evidence of how deep the fear went. Graffiti etched into dungeon walls. "God forgive them. Truth is not found in pain. I am innocent." Words carved by hands that would never see sunlight. Again, experts describe the Inquisition as one of history's first experiments in psychological control. It wasn't just about physical pain, it was about shaping minds. Torture was only one part of a vast system of intimidation, surveillance, and guilt. People were taught to suspect themselves. Confession was glorified, but silence was deadly. The Inquisitors used theology as a weapon, turning salvation into submission. And that's what made it so effective. It didn't just destroy bodies, it conquered souls. By the late 1700s, the world was ready to move on. But the Inquisition clung to power like a ghost that refused to fade. Even after Spain lost its colonies and faced internal revolutions, the machinery of fear still ground on in dusty rooms filled with crucifixes and parchment. It wasn't until 1834, more than 350 years after it began, that Queen Isabella II finally abolished it. But by then, its damage was already written into the nation's soul. And yet, perhaps the most haunting question remains: did the Inquisition ever truly end? Or did it merely change its face? Every time a belief system demands obedience through fear, every time justice is twisted by faith, the echoes of the Inquisition return. We see it in modern regimes that punish dissent, in institutions that silence truth in the name of morality. The tools have changed. No more racks or pyres, but the pattern is the same: power, cloaked in righteousness, feeding on submission. So when we look back at the Spanish Inquisition, we aren't just looking at a distant past. We're staring into a mirror, one that reflects the darkest potential of the human soul. Because the true horror wasn't the fire, or the chains, or even the screams. It was the belief that such cruelty could ever be holy. The deeper you go into the records of the Inquisition, the more surreal it becomes, like walking through a cathedral built not for worship, but for terror. Every corridor leads to another confession. Every shadow hides another victim. The official documents, written in careful Latin, sound almost bureaucratic, detached, yet behind every sentence lies a human being whose life was unmade. You can almost hear the scratching of the quill as an inquisitor records a confession extracted under agony, the wax seal pressed onto parchment still warm from candlelight. Those cold signatures turned suffering into law. And the strangest part is that those who carried out this cruelty often believed they were saving souls. To them, pain was purification. Each scream, a prayer of release. Imagine a young woman named Isabel, standing before the tribunal in Seville around 1570. She's accused of witchcraft, though she has never cast a spell in her life. Her neighbors claimed she spoke to the wind, that her crops grew too well. Her family watches as she's questioned, first gently, then cruelly. The inquisitors ask her to name others. When she refuses, she's sent to the dungeon. There, she's stretched on the rack until her body gives way. When she finally confesses, naming no one, only herself, her confession is celebrated as proof of divine justice. She dies in silence, believing perhaps that God will forgive what men never did. Her name disappears from history, buried among thousands like her. But Isabel's story isn't unique. Across centuries, the Inquisition targeted anyone who strayed from the line. Jews, Muslims, Protestants, mystics, scholars, healers, and even Catholics whose faith seemed too strange, too emotional. It was a campaign not just against heresy, but against individuality. Conformity became sacred. Thought itself became dangerous. The inquisitors operated with perfect logic. If truth is absolute, then doubt is treason. And yet, that very certainty was what made their faith monstrous. Modern historians often ask, why did so many ordinary people support it? The answer is both simple and terrifying. Fear unites. When the Inquisition burned a heretic, the crowd felt safer. Not because justice was done, but because they were reminded what happened to those who questioned. It gave meaning to their suffering, order to their chaos. The Church promised salvation, the crown promised purity, and the people, desperate for stability, believed. They accepted the unthinkable because the alternative was uncertainty. That's how terror sustains itself, by making cruelty seem righteous. The inquisitorial records even reveal moments of dark irony. Some inquisitors doubted their own mission but continued it anyway. One judge wrote privately in his diary, "I no longer know if I serve God or my own fear." Another, years later, confessed on his deathbed that he had nightmares of the men he condemned. Yet, for centuries, the machine kept running. It was too vast, too embedded, too sanctified to stop. In every major Spanish city, Toledo, Seville, Valencia, there stood tribunals, dungeons, and execution grounds. Each had its own rhythm, its own smell of wax, smoke, and despair. Imagine walking through one of those chambers now. Hundreds of years later, the air feels heavy, the stones cold to the touch. Tour guides speak in hushed tones, pointing to hooks in the wall, to marks on the floor where chains once dragged. Visitors shiver, not from the chill, but from the knowledge that they stand where countless souls once begged for mercy. Some say you can still hear faint whispers at night in the ruins of old prisons, the prayers of those who never escaped. Whether ghosts exist or not, the atmosphere itself feels haunted. It's as if the stones remember. Experts studying the psychology of the Inquisition describe it as a theater of fear. Everything, from the silence of the courtroom to the rhythmic chanting of prayers during torture, was choreographed. It was designed to break the human spirit with precision. Yet the very thoroughness of this cruelty is what preserved it in history. Every record, every confession, every execution was archived. The Inquisition left behind one of the largest paper trails of oppression ever created. And those same archives that once justified pain now testify against it. The words meant to prove heresy now reveal horror. Even centuries later, those words still have power. When researchers open the old ledgers, they find human lives compressed into neat lines of ink, confessed under duress, reconciled through pain, delivered to the secular arm. Behind each phrase is a human heartbeat that was stopped in the name of righteousness. It's a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it writes. Sometimes it documents. Sometimes it prays. By the late 18th century, Spain began to realize that the world was moving on without it. The Enlightenment had reshaped Europe. Revolutions were redefining freedom. And yet, the Inquisition lingered like an ancient shadow. Intellectuals fled or fell silent. Other nations mocked Spain as a land of superstition and tyranny. Still, the old order clung on, insisting that faith demanded sacrifice. But the fires no longer inspired awe. They inspired shame. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, his armies shut down many tribunals. For a brief moment, the dungeons were empty. But after the French left, the Inquisition returned, a ghost resurrected. Its power, however, was fading. By 1834, the final decree came. The Holy Office was abolished. When that news spread, people celebrated quietly, almost uncertainly. Centuries of fear don't vanish overnight. The prisons were opened, the documents sealed. And Spain, wounded and weary, stepped into a new era. Yet the echoes of that time remained. In its art, its literature, its silence. The Inquisition had done something deeper than burn bodies. It had burned ideas. Think about that. For more than 300 years, an institution taught millions that truth could be tortured into existence, that obedience was holiness, that fear was faith. And those lessons don't die easily. Even today, historians say the Inquisition's shadow lingers. In censorship, in blind nationalism, in any system that demands devotion over understanding. When people surrender their conscience to authority, the old fires flicker again. And yet, amidst all that darkness, there were moments of courage. Secret groups hid banned books. Ordinary men and women whispered forbidden prayers. Some priests risked their lives to protect the accused. The human spirit, though crushed, never vanished completely. It flickered, small, stubborn, defiant. Like a candle in a storm, it refused to go out. If you stand today in front of the old tribunal in Toledo or Seville, you'll see tourists walking, cameras flashing, guides speaking softly about those dark times. But if you listen closely, past the noise, past the laughter, you might hear the silence beneath. The kind of silence that comes from centuries of whispered prayers and broken confessions. That silence is history's voice. It reminds us that behind every doctrine, every institution, every belief, there are people, and that when belief turns blind, humanity suffers. So when we tell the story of the Spanish Inquisition, we're not just remembering a chapter of cruelty. We're confronting a warning. Power wrapped in holiness is the most dangerous kind. It asks not just for your obedience, but for your soul. And the moment we stop questioning, the moment we accept that pain can ever serve truth, we step back into those dungeons. The Inquisition may have ended in name, but its lesson endures. Never surrender thought to fear, and never confuse faith with control. Because the real heresy isn't doubting the truth. It's killing for it. As the fires of the Spanish Inquisition faded into history, what remained were ashes not just of the condemned, but of an entire era's conscience. The stone walls of its prisons still stand in silence, their air heavy with memories of faith twisted into terror. And while centuries have passed, the echoes of those cries remind us of how fragile morality becomes when it is blinded by certainty. Every time humanity has claimed to kill in the name of truth, the same story repeats. Only the names change. So tonight, as you close your eyes, think about the millions who prayed for mercy in those chambers of fear. They were mothers, fathers, dreamers, people like us. Their pain became a lesson carved into history's soul, that no belief, no cause, and no God ever demands cruelty. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. History still has shadows, and we'll keep exploring them one dark truth at a time.